K.K. George. Welcome to the 4th Professor K.K. George Memorial Lecture. Over the past years, this lecture series has brought together eminent scholars who share the spirit that Professor George embodied: rigor, relevance, and a deep commitment to Kerala's development experience. Today, we continue that tradition with renewed purpose. Professor George, fondly known as KKG, left an indelible impression on the fields of public finance, welfare economics, and Kerala's development debates. A former director of the School of Management Studies, CUSAT, and the founding chairperson of CSES, his influence extends far beyond the institutions he built. His work on center-state relations, fiscal federalism, and decentralized governance continues to guide policymakers and researchers even today. Before we move further, let us formally begin the proceedings. May I invite Dr. Sam Thomas, Director, School of Management Studies, CUSAT, to deliver the welcome address.
President of the function, Professor P.K. Michael Tharagan, Chairperson, CSES. The chief guest of the day and who will be delivering the KKG Memorial Lecture, Ms. Sarada Muraleedharan, former Chief Secretary, Government of Kerala. Dr. Raki Timothy, Fellow CSES, distinguished members in the audience, well-wishers, friends of KK George, and my dear students. This is a very inspiring moment for all of us as we celebrate another edition of Professor KK George Memorial Distinguished Lecture Series. Professor KK George, KKG as he is very popularly known, was a very distinguished person, a very eminent economist, an academician par excellence, and role model for all of us, including youngsters like me who joined under him. As an economist, I'm sure Professor Michael Tharagan will elaborate on that. He has done very phenomenal work on Kerala model of development, central state financing relations, interstate issues. He had a lot of collaboration with some of the most reputed economists across the globe, and the kind of work he has done remain so relevant and inspirational to the budding economists today. As an administrator, he proved himself as the director of School of Management Studies, and I had the fortune of joining under him. In fact, he recruited a bunch of youngsters at that point of time, including me. And so that is why it's a very special and emotional moment for me also, as today as I sit in that great chair occupied by him, I pay my personal tributes also to KK George sir. And the kind of effort he took in building SMS was phenomenal. He was so concerned about all the youngsters. In fact, he happened to be the oldest professor. I happened to be the youngest at that point of time, talking about 99. And he was so particular about taking care of each one of us, molding us, mentoring us, guiding us, giving all support. In fact, his special affection, he wanted me to join him in teaching a module of his course. He was a stalwart in international economics. I was so much afraid. But then he gave me all the courage, made me sit in his room. In fact, that helped me to develop myself as a teacher. They were all very remarkable days. And I'm sure all the people who joined at that point of time. Today, the program is presided over by Professor Michael Tharagan sir, former Vice Chancellor of Kannur University, former Director of KILA. He has occupied a range of top positions in various public assignments and a very well-known figure in the academic circles of Kerala. Currently, he is... So, ma'am, we are really indebted to you for accepting our invitation and being here today to deliver KK George Memorial Lecture. On behalf of all of us here, I extend you a very hearty welcome, ma'am. We are joined by a galaxy of eminent personalities here. I'm not going to name each one of us.
He has marked his presence in the public sphere of Kerala as an eminent scholar, gifted teacher, policy advisor, and most of all, as an endearing mentor and guide. There are other aspects of his public and private life, including that of an efficient institution builder, which also deserves mention. What is most impressive was that all these abilities were contained within an easygoing, ever-smiling, inclusive personality. Many of his students, friends, and acquaintances will even now be able to share the memory of the touch of his fingers over their shoulders. Never have I witnessed an angry K.K. George. And mind you, my knowledge of him is fairly long. After being educated in the Union Christian College, Alva, and Madras Christian College, Tambaram, he taught for a while at Catholicate College, Pattanamthitta, and also worked in the State Bank of India. His period in the State Bank made him, as his own character might have dictated, to start asking fundamental questions about monetary economics, industrial economics, regional economics, and the economics of international trade and finance. These questions were published in leading newspapers like Economic Times, Financial Express, and Business Standard in the form of articles, sometimes under a pseudonym, G.K. Colonial, which has got its own story behind it. These questions and articles led him naturally to deeper academic involvement and research, and his association with the Center for Development Studies, and particularly to his association with Professor I.S. Goody. Two of his substantial works on center-state relations, center-state financial relations, by himself and the other in association with Professor Gulai, were done during this period. K. George's cardinal interventions, apart from public finance and other closely related subjects, were broadly in two areas. One was critically looking at the then widely discussed Kerala model of development. The book on Lim's model not only became a forerunner to the number of critical comments which came out later. This critique was not of the general kind, but were on the building restrictions of the model. I got a feeling that George's prophetic vision did not get the kind and sort of immediate type of attention that it deserved. Also focused on how to solve the second generation problems emerging out of the apparent success of the Kerala model. He was one of the earliest scholars to have argued for the economic development of Kerala being based on so-called postmodern skill and knowledge-intensive development. He argued for further investment in human resources development, both for exports and the state's own labor market. George wanted Kerala to be further integrated with its past achievements in the social sector, brought about at huge cost to the exchequer. It is important to recognize Professor K.K. George's arguments raised in his joint working paper with K.K. Krishna Kumar in 2009 on Kerala's development experience, implications for finance commissions. Along with these, should be remembered his involvement in drafting Kerala's memorandum to the 14th Finance Commission. This played a major role in the inclusion of forest cover as a devolution criteria by the Union Finance Commission. While 19 states gained from the new arrangement on a per capita basis, Kerala, Chhattisgarh, and Madhya Pradesh were the top gainers. He had pointed out that, and I am quoting, Kerala was expected to be allocated no less than rupees 8,000 crores on account of the new devolution criteria. Probably he, having come from a banking background and not from a purely academic background, might have played a role, a demeaning role in academic community and its own hierarchies and stratifications. What impresses most is that in his own quiet, smiling way, he managed to pick one which richly corresponds and supports the ideals and purposes for which Professor K.K. George took a position in favor. In our search so far, we have succeeded in getting highly distinguished scholars such as Pinaki Chakravarti, C.P. Chandrasekhar, and Ole Tornquist. This year also, we have been able to get no less a person than Ms. Sarada Muraleedharan, leading public official and a highly sensitive administrator. Her achievements in the field of public service has generated discussions and debates of vital implications in academic circles too. Rarely has a chief minister of a state has said about his most important public official that she was also a person who has shone as an activist, as Honorable Pinarayi special pride and satisfaction for me to present Ms. Sarada Muraleedharan to speak on decentralization and climate resilience in this K.K. George Memorial Lecture 2025. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We are deeply honored to have with us Ms. Sarada Muraleedharan, former Chief Secretary of the Government of Kerala. Her career is marked by her deep commitment to social justice and development. She held several key positions at the Government of India and in the Government of Kerala. She has served in pivotal roles such as Joint Secretary, Ministry of Panchayati Raj, Chief Operating Officer, National Rural Livelihoods Mission, Additional Chief Secretary, Local Self-Government Department, Kerala. Above and beyond positions held, her career is marked by the role she played in making governance inclusive and participatory. She also redefined leadership in public service. Her leadership in the Kudumbashree mission was pivotal in conceptualizing its core activities to address gender empowerment, poverty reduction, and dignity at work. With immense respect, I invite Ms. Sarada Muraleedharan to deliver the 4th Professor K.K. George Memorial Lecture on the theme Decentralized Governance and Climate Resilience.
Dr. Michael Taran, Professor Sam Thomas, Dr. Ralph Timothy, distinguished academicians who are joining in, as well as I see young students and scholars also who are here. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Good. So, I'd actually from my face. Well, when I asked Rakhi how long am I supposed to speak, she said 25 to 30 minutes. And then I realized that I had something that was about twice that long. So I've been, in the train journey here, I've been cutting and sliding. But I'll be happy to share the paper with you. So let me get straight into today's topic. So Professor George championed the cause of evidence-based interventions and skilled communities for a more environment-conscious local governance. When we look at climate action for resilience, it's generally regarded as the domain of national governments and the international community. But in Kerala, we've had a unique experiment that has been unfolding in the local government space. New technologies, new understanding, new skill models, new systems approaches perhaps would be required and need to be deliberated upon. So this local climate adaptation that we have started off may become a stone for global resistance and survival. This is a premise of the memorial lecture that I'm making today in honor of Professor A.K. George and his legacy. He shall forever remain a giant associate giving direction to the early days of decentralized governance in Kerala. I'm grateful to the School of Management Studies, QSA, and CSES for having given this opportunity to deliver the memorial lecture and for choosing this topic that poses both present danger and immense opportunity. The challenges of climate change have been primarily discussed at the level of the global community. That is indisputably to the planet in its entirety. It was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change during Earth Summit at Rio de Janeiro, which attempted for the first time to take countries accountable to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Later, the Paris Agreement produced a global commitment, and this is to bring global temperature rise to well below 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. So despite the fact that it had 198 nation signatories, these global efforts have not been successful in controlling, in reining temperature rise because of the difficulties that participant countries have been facing in controlling consumption, development, and unsustainable practices. The UNEP and International Energy Agency reports now indicate that the 1.5 degree window itself, forget 2 degrees, is fast closing, if not already closed. So, for countries, the fight against climate change has been about policy restructuring, funding commitments, regigging socio-economic activity. That includes large-scale projects as well, enforcing responsible consumption, and protecting the environment, but, and there is a but, without disrupting their prevailing development mantra. So, on the global map, climate change is impacted by international trade agreements, policies which accelerate or decelerate certain types of initiatives that create significant impact. And therefore, the issues of climate change have always been seen as matters to be handled by international bodies, nation states, and regional entities. That there could be a local footprint which could be worked out and which would be relevant has not really been a matter of study or research. Now, coming to India, the Disaster Management Act of 2005 was the first to look at a calibrated response at multiple levels of nation, state, and local to the incidence of disasters in the country. At the time, however, the consequences of climate change for disaster had not been considered. Although prevention and mitigation you find in the Act itself find very frequent mention. The Act does acknowledge local governments as local authorities and has a chapter in which certain limited responsibilities are indicated. In Kerala, ever since the constitutional amendments, the role played by local governments in disaster management has been pretty small. It's been a minor role for shelter management. We've been collecting clothing, daily essentials, moving people to relief camps, supporting the taluk and district administrations in providing food to people in the camps. So it's been very limited, the role that local governments have played. The larger role here has been played by the revenue authorities, from the district collector to the village officer, aided by the police, who have generally been first responders in a disaster. The local self-government, its elected committee, its various people's committees, its core personnel have not been actively engaged in disaster management or relief. The district administration very often uses the services of field officers associated with the local government, but these are called in the context of their line departments and not as local government officers. And their activities have also been coordinated by line departments and not by the local government per se. August 2018 changed all that. The floods that hit Kerala, panchayat after panchayat, town after town, not only caught the system by surprise, but were merciless in the scale and the pace of escalation. It had been all hands to the deck. All of government disaster response mechanisms, the NDRF, the SDRF, armed forces, everyone was pressed into immediate action. The role of fisherfolk and Kudumbashree in this extraordinary effort has been acknowledged widely. But in the immediate aftermath, it was interesting to see there was hardly any formal recognition from the state government or the civic community of the role that elected representatives of the local governments had played in combating the disaster. There was a smattering of commentary, particularly from the central forces, of how the incredible local understanding that the local governments displayed as first responders, of their ability to harness resources for the rescue effort, and how that made all the difference, quick response and the turnaround time. And it was responsible for keeping casualties in an event of this scale so low. It had also become evident to exhausted district administrations of how critical local governments were in coordinating the post-disaster cleanup and restoration effort. So slowly, the narrative is beginning to change, and local governments are finding a space or are being entrusted in a further space than they had been hitherto given. So in September 2018, a new local LSG level working group. So as you know, working groups are responsible for coming up with project ideas that enter the local government plans. A new, and the 13th working group, which was constituted, was a working group. So we've got working groups on SD communities, on health, on education, on infrastructure. But this one that came in was on biodiversity, climate change, environment protection, and disaster management. So it was, again, a recognition that there perhaps is a big role to play here. But the state's acceptance of a larger role for local governments, it first emanated out of a decision to involve local government personnel in the assessment of damage and loss to households. And then this later burgeoned into a reluctant, and I will say it is reluctant because it's not been easy. Most of you would know that after the first flush of decentralization, no further responsibilities and authority have been devolved to local governments per se. So here was, it was a reluctant acceptance that the coordination of the community effort in disaster management was best done by local governments. And this was consolidated in a program, in a campaign, the Nammal Namakkai campaign, which sought to consolidate the gains of volunteerism which had been generated by the disaster and centered the role of local governments in civil defense and creation of Sannadha Senas. A critical step was taken at that time also to formulate the creation of disaster management plans for all local governments and posited as a mandatory component of the 2020 annual plan of the local governments. So this was to attempt a community-based intervention under the supervision of local governments to formulate these plans. The idea was also to capture the lived experience of the elected representatives and the bodies who had been associated with 2018 and 2019 disasters. KESREC and KSDMA, that is the State Disaster Management Authority, they provided about 25 to 32 local self-government specific maps, topography, rainfall, flood patterns, cropping patterns, road and other infrastructure, settlement patterns, heat signatures, etc. This was to enable the assessment based on locally relevant data. For the very first time, we were able to look at decentralizing data and make it available to local governments. And through this, you were also able to see temporal shifts that were happening on the basis of these maps. And the gist of the instructions were for creation of emergency response teams and local resource groups that would be undertaking the exercise of situation analysis as well as be trained for emergency response. And a community-based exercise with PRA techniques like transect walks, FGDs, etc., which would capture changes, local changes in weather patterns, risk assessment of disaster, inventorize the local infrastructure and human resources, and as well, basically also look at equipment and tools from boats to ropes that would be available and generators. So there was an entire list that of items that would come needy in the context of a disaster that the local governments actually sat and inventorized, including taking on phone numbers of those people who would be able to move these resources. A SWOT analysis was taken at both the local government and ward level. Vulnerable communities and settlements were identified, evacuation plans were to be drawn up, and so the areas from preparedness to search and rescue, shelter management, and then you look at rehabilitation and mitigation. So this is a gamut of intervention that was looked at, and KSDMA and KILA were to jointly undertake the capacity building of this effort. Now, from looking only at floods, cyclones, and landslides to appreciating rising temperatures, heat waves, droughts, wildfires, lightning strikes, all of these, you found that there was actually a significant pronounced shift leading to a disaster climate change adaptation continuum in the way we were looking at things. Now, it is to be remembered that Schedule 11 and Schedule 12 of the Indian Constitution, when they were drawn up, the global challenge that climate change adaptation posed had not been anticipated. So you will find that the schedules create nothing about the management of disasters or the understanding that there is a local footprint there. So no mention of warning mitigation is mentioned in the schedules. But you will see that also that agriculture, soil conservation, watershed development, social forestry, village industries, fuel and fodder, non-conventional energy, health sanitation, vulnerable communities, community assets, all of this do find space. And Schedule 12, which deals with the urban local governments, talks about urban planning, regulation of land use, water supply, public health sanitation, urban forestry, protection of the environment, cattle pounds, fire services, and safeguarding of weaker sections. So what you see is that there is actually enough of a recipe which will ground local governments and give them the space, a very, a legitimate space in working for climate change adaptation. So coming to the Kerala Acts, the Kerala Panchayat Raj Act and the Municipalities Act also cede the disaster management space to the district administration and revenue authorities. They do not articulate a clearly defined role for local governments. There is mention of draining floodwaters and increasing environment awareness, but that's about it. But now that the vagaries of erratic climate behavior are known to impact all of these sectors, it becomes imperative that local governments adapt the capability of playing their role responsibility so as to minimize damage and enhance resilience. So now, coming back to the disaster management exercise, we had a very small window, actually. The idea of the disaster management plan was thrown up in December 2019. They were supposed to catch the 2020 annual plan making process. And as you all know, that was also when COVID hit us. So it was in the middle of this that the DM plans got going. So obviously, we did not do quite the job that we wanted to do. And so many elements of this plan did not evolve at the time. But one thing did happen, and which was inventorization and information regarding community resources. And this information became a lifesaver during the COVID shutdown. Because when, in the rest of the country, apart from the major cities, they had no clue as to what was going on in villages and little towns. In Kerala, we knew everywhere. We knew where you had nurses, generators, doctors who could be pulled in. Additionally, people who had returned from services, retired personnel, details, etc. Everything was available. You needed to set up institutional quarantine centers, COVID treatment centers, facility centers, all of this. Again, we did that in the space of 3 days, 1 week. All of these centers were positioned and made operational, and that was primarily because you had this huge database to fall back upon. So this was a turnaround that was possible only in Kerala, nowhere else in the country was it possible, and that was because this data was available. And then comes, the 2018 floods also brought the World Bank to our doorstep, and the Rebuild Kerala initiative took off. And this initiative set the ball rolling for a more ambitious space in the matter of disaster management and climate adaptation. So questions that we asked were, 1, can climate information and modeling be undertaken at local levels to permit local adaptations that are more evidence-based? 2, can spatial planning be undertaken by local governments that actually incorporates risk information? 3, can a governance paradigm be created to assimilate responsible and sustainable elements into projects to improve climate-based resilience? And 4, what would be the local policy initiatives that are required to incentivize climate-resilient adaptations into infrastructure and housing, lifestyles, livelihoods? So this was the ask. For us, the thinking that went into the program was that maybe we should start with disaster management, because we get them involved in disaster management and push them towards looking at preparedness and mitigation, you can incrementally bring in the need for climate change adaptation into the sphere of activity of local governments. So you already have the local resource pools that are being created who are concerned about the environment and the fragility of ecosystems. They would naturally veer the discourse into long-term sustainable solutions, while simultaneously also looking at immediate measures. And any discussion on reducing the risk of disaster would lead to the need for mitigation, preparedness, and adaptation to reduce or neutralize long-term risk. So some of these measures would be about the ability, local ability, to handle aberrant climate patterns. But some of it would also be about contributing to reducing the negative impact on the environment. So climate adaptive measures would touch the areas of natural resource management, responsible construction, reduction of heat signature, rehabilitation of vulnerable persons, responsible consumption, etc. I had much more detail in my paper, but we'll stop at that. 2 important initiatives that were rolled out under the Rebuild Kerala initiative for the program for results, they call it P4R, in respect of local self-government department, one was the risk-informed master plans for urban local bodies, and the other was the DCAT, that is the Disaster Climate Action Tracking Tool. And what did DCAT do? It basically scored the local governments on the nature of their climate adaptive interventions. So both of these were actually looking at bringing in evidence-based inputs into the gamut of LSG planning. The area of operation, the physical area was the Pamba Basin. So all the districts of the Pamba Basin were brought into the scope of this intervention. And simultaneously, feeding off these technical inputs, there was also another exercise happening. You had the National Action Plan for Climate Change, the State Action Plan for Climate Change, and because in Kerala, we also came up with the Local Action Plan for Climate Change. And this was coordinated again by Kila. So Kila became the center, the repository of all this action. Now the Kerala policy initiatives that were happening, because one important thing is you want to bring in risk-informed master plans, you needed to go back to the Act and work on it. So the Kerala Town and Country Planning Act 2016 was modified in 2021. Again, pretty unprecedented that in 5 years' time you change an act, but it was done. And here it was about incorporating two elements. One was risk information and the other was spatial planning into the master plan process. Also, it telescoped the period of planning, brought the period down and made the master plan agile, because one thing we realized was that your understanding of how the world works and the challenges it faces and the kind of, and the way we do things is changing very rapidly. And because of that, the plans also, master plans also cannot afford to be rigid. They need to be agile. They need to also be responsive and change with the understanding, with the new challenges that are coming our way. And so agility was also incorporated into the whole planning process. And this, along with the community-based situation analysis, formed the backdrop of the risk-informed master plan. So this was an effort to converge people's lived experience and understanding with scientific data and climate modeling to enable master plans that understood climate risks, that had appropriate adaptation and resilience interventions, and provided doable solutions. So you would be doing a balancing act of the need for growth on the one side and the need to conserve and secure the environment for the future. The data that was used, satellite imagery from Sentinel-1 and 2, rainfall data from IMD, soil data from Soil Conservation Department, information from traffic and transportation services, GIS flood data, flood analysis data, flood accumulation, precipitation, soil type, infiltration, slope and elevation, geomorphology. All of these were available and went into the figuring out as to identifying areas and hazard zones, etc. Flood simulation software was used. You had a 25 to 50 year return period was also looked at. But remember that there was a lot of field information that was also coming in. So you had to do a balancing act of looking at what did the field information tell you. And the problem with much of this data is that it does not understand the resilience of local communities. So local communities themselves develop capabilities of tackling disasters. And so the idea of this plan was to say, don't just base yourself on this, also look at what communities have been doing, how they have their perception and understanding of disasters and coping mechanisms, and look at integrating the two. So, for the state, it has always been a challenge to get the local governments to see the master plan as a fine-honed tool for sustainable development. It has only been seen as a regulatory axe, no matter that it is the LSD itself that is approving this master plan. So evidence-based planning will work only if there is ownership by the local government and its people. So an important challenge is to get both the elected local government and the local communities to see the benefit and common good in the nature of planning that goes into risk-informed master plans. This ownership is not easy. It does not come easy. It requires unbundling of data analysis into common parlance, demystification. It involves constant engagement and explanation and patience. It requires debunking myths, but also being very able to communicate firmly the perils of future that contribute a clear and present danger. It also means assuaging concerns and softening costs, so that because you cannot load all these costs on the community alone. because sometimes when that happens, it'll be impossible for them to actually take those sustainable decisions. And the transition, it is important that we make the transition into a responsible climate adaptive economy a matter of local demand. So what happened with the risk-informed master plans that we started coming through? So the understandings that came is, one, you need to locate critical infrastructure outside flood-prone areas. You needed to replace your overhead transmission lines with underground cables in the floodplains. Raised platforms for transformers, so all of this pertains to electricity. Retrofitting of septic tanks with control valves and inspection chambers, very doable. Emergency communication systems when communication systems break down. Disaster resilient infrastructure, that is bridges and roads that will not just disappear and are able to take on the pressure of disasters. Climate smart agricultural land use. Flood forecasting and warning system. Buffer zones around rivers and streams. Sponge parks for holding excess water. And freeing up of riparian areas, river areas for smooth water flow. So if you read through these instructions or suggestions, you see that many of them should not raise hackles with the community if properly explained. But what you find is that still is reluctance. And where is that reluctance coming from? It usually comes from the elected body itself, where there are additional costs that are brought in, and these they feel are unnecessarily incurred. So unless the value and benefit of these incremental improvements are appreciated, it becomes difficult to push them through. Some of these interventions, because again, in the local governments, unfortunately, what we have fostered is a ward level orientation to schemes and projects. And so you do not see the bigger picture. You find it very reluctant to look at the bigger picture, and therefore you do not see immediate impact or visible impact. And if you don't see visible impact, you think there is no prioritization. It is not worthy of prioritization. So it might be mentioned, but as a project, it will never actually get going. But there is also a problem. Some of these would be seen, like, sponge parks, freeing up of riparian area, buffer zones. All of this would be seen as affecting livelihood, housing, lifestyle choices of local populations. And then there would be quite a bit of recalcitrance and pushback. So the challenge that the risk-informed master plan faces is it needs to be able to A, unbundle scientific data analysis, B, ensure clear communication, 3, facilitate informed decision-making, and 4, commit funds to climate-smart adaptations. Very clearly, informed communities who are able to connect climate change with their lives and with the well-being and future of their communities, as well as envision practical, pragmatic local solutions, are critical to steer local governments into climate-resilient strategies. So, alongside the disaster management plans and the RKI intervention, KILA had also developed the LabCC, I had mentioned, which was looking at regulatory measures, climate leadership, awareness creation, and capacity building at the local government level. So the LabCC actually, it started with the people themselves coming up and identifying problems which they thought had a climate dimension. So the ones, in the 260 odd local governments which fall within the Pamba Basin area, the issues identified were wetland reclamation, coastal erosion, saltwater intrusion, temperature, increase in temperature which is affecting livestock health and productivity, decline in agricultural yields, disappearance of local fish varieties, increase in vector-borne and waterborne diseases, decline in the population of beneficial insects and earthworms, increase in the population of pests, flies, and migratory birds, changes in flowering times, increase in invasive plant species and aquatic weeds, increase in avian flu, and accumulation of non-biodegradable waste. So not only did they identify these problems, they also came up with solutions, again, pragmatic solutions of how these could be tackled. So elevated constructions to withstand flooding, strengthening of bunds, soft stabilization techniques for coastal erosion, restoration of water sources, rainwater harvesting, etc., water budgeting, planting of mangroves and protecting sacred groves, integrated pest management, climate smart farming techniques, comprehensive plan for animal husbandry, scientific waste management, no burn policy, green protocols, sewage plants. My dream has not been coming through though. Pre-monsoon sanitation, green constructions, solar panels, well recharging, etc. Electric vehicles and charging stations, bioenergy crops, local biodiversity, and finally the idea of a carbon neutral panchayats and filament free panchayats. So these are all ideas that actually came out of local communities. Now, as ideas, they're wonderful, but the problem is these ideas don't get pushed and they don't happen. Wonderful ideas are generated, but wonderful ideas do not get converted into wonderful projects. So, which is where DCAT comes in. Now, DCAT, what does DCAT do? It is a disaster climate action tracker. And it looks at disaster management interventions, sectoral interventions, governance interventions, and then it attributes weightages to them. And then it basically tells a panchayat or a municipality, this is where you stand. These interventions are, are good for the climate, are adaptive. These are, don't have an impact, but these are negative. And your total score gives you a picture of where exactly you stand on the climate adaptation scale. So, and this gets then incorporated into Sulega and the DCAT is also based on a hazard, vulnerability, and risk assessment of each specific local government. Where does this local government stand on the HVRA index? And accordingly, you look to see as to whether it's climate adaptive measures, and it's general. So it is not just about what it's doing for the climate, but whether its general interventions and general activities are actually looking towards climate resilience. So it shows that straight away, it gives you a picture of what are the areas to improve upon, what are the interventions you need to minimize or avoid. And so it becomes added to this whole understanding that local communities are generating with regard to the threat of climate and disaster. It helps to push local governments to prioritize action based on risk perception. But let me tell you, having worked in the department, I know that that too is not enough. You still will not get local governments to put in that kind of initiative. So then comes this question, is it possible to incentivize local governments? We had mentioned about sometimes the cost of this is too heavy to be borne by individuals and to be responsible. The same goes for local governments. It might be too heavy for local governments as well. So can you incentivize financially, again, incentivize local governments? So taking cue from the 14th Finance Commission, which came up with the idea of performance grants for local governments to say that, okay, in certain parameters, if you've done well, you are eligible to get performance grants. So this was what was attempted here as well. So DCAT scores, so you not just evaluated a local government, you had attributed scores, and you said you achieve a certain score, you will release additional funds and resources to you for development. So that has been the framework. Now, of course, if we look at these interventions, there are other spin-offs also to the climate change story. In Kerala, we've seen increased human-wildlife conflict. And this is at least in part due to the disruption of natural habitats from invasive species, human intrusion, water scarcity, unpredictable weather patterns. And it is actually a rupture in the fabric of ecosystems. Zoonotic diseases
And look, Kerala is, for your information, Kerala is a global hotbed of zoonotic diseases. So Nipah and monkey fever, we've got many of these. The special species of amoebic, gastroencephalitis that we are seeing. Also, all these are indicative of zoonotic diseases which are hitting Kerala. And this is also has a direct connect to this rupture in the ecosystem fabric. But what we do realize is that, and that's something that we saw even before all these ideas from the state went down, because when we talked to district panchayats, we found that almost of the 14 district panchayats, 10 of them had prioritized human-wildlife conflict as intervention space. And this was way back in 2019 when it had not achieved the kind of attention that it has right now. So now comes the responsibility of the state. What is the responsibility of the state? It has a responsibility of providing and augmenting the policy framework. Because incentivizing green constructions requires state orders and instructions. To ensure responsible infrastructure development, bringing in defect liability periods, insisting on minimum standards, all of this is again within the purview of the state. Enforcing comprehensive waste management solutions through law and also through interventions. And also redirecting subsidy regimes towards climate resilient socio-economic behavior. I mean, you might have subsidies. If you look at the Amazon basin, for instance, the Amazon rainforest, we've got, you look at Peru, where there's been a sharp decline in deforestation only because indigenous tribes have been given their rights to the land. Whereas in neighboring, in Brazil, what has happened is that this has gone to, subsidies have been going in for animal husbandry, for cattle breeding and raising. And this has led to a rapid escalation of deforestation. And this also has its global ramifications because, there's global trade, and then when you have all these farms coming up, then roads get built, further the environment destroyed. So, and how is this happening? Because there is a huge subsidy push by the government. And so how the governments decide and push work with regard to subsidies has a great way of impacting on whether the climate imperative is addressed or we actually go multiple steps back. Now, with regard to data, today's space technology and access to data has generated a capability of assimilating and decoding data like never before. I mean, we were shown examples of how you want to see heat signatures, where in forests, shrinking water sources close to human habitations, you'll be able to actually predict movement of animals when they will enter into the human space by virtue of understanding all the triggers, because satellite data will be giving you information right up front. So that kind of information, so the precision of the data, information which is available right now is unprecedented. And if we can have LSG access to such information, that can be a huge game changer. Now, having said that, it is also important to remember that assuming capability within a local government, photo decoding, analyzing, interpreting, and applying data, that is a huge ask. And they are not capable of it right now. There has to be a support grid which is led by the state that helps making this information available as well as relevant and usable. So maybe you could look at locating that within Kila with AI tools today so that you can access, interpret, and demystify data for specific local self-governments. You could have a strategy of constant engagement with communities of communicating this information, and all of this could be, again, we could look at how this could be anchored. There has to be also a systemic integration of the climate agenda into the functioning of the local government. And that will happen only if outcome-based planning and implementation becomes central to the local governance paradigm. We would require to have a huge rewrite of what we are doing right now. Because today, we have left it to local governments to work out projects. There are, out of the 1,000 projects and the 1,000 local governments and 30,000 projects that come up, I think less than 100 would actually be more than one ward, inter-ward or inter-LSG. And that is wrong. We cannot afford to be limited by our boundaries in planning and execution. And to be able to get a local government councillor or member to think of themselves as part of the local government and not just of the ward is very critical. And that requires an entire, reformatting, which needs to be done. And we would need to have community-oriented professionals, planners, who would be able to undertake the role of facilitating climate adaptation to need, looking at the possibilities, need, and the challenges. We could also have maybe looking at some models. There is a provision for special action plans in the new Town and Country Planning Act. And so hand-holding and making climate resilient special action plans might become beacons for new local governments and for the state. And we should also be able to look finally at a funding innovation. Maybe we could look at how the 14th Finance Commission separated basic and performance grants and do precisely that going forward with the local governments, so that you have an objective assessment of performance and intent. So balance equity with purpose, because it is important to create models of resilience and then to universalize them. And maybe a refined DCAT methodology would perhaps generate interest for the long haul in climate resilience. This, of course, the underlying factor is that there has to be a strong political will for long-term sustainability, but then it starts with the exposure of the political will to all these issues and possibilities. So a beginning has been made. It has opened the window to possibilities of effective climate change adaptation, but whether this experiment will get absorbed and institutionalized as a model of survival and strength in the arena of global climate change actually remains unanswered. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for the clarity that you have provided on the significance of local government and communities on climate resilience. We will now open the floor for a brief Q&A session. Due to time constraints, we'll take 2 to 3 questions from the audience.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Shivadat. I'm a student of SMS CUSAT. So my question is, how students can effectively take a effective role in disaster management? Can you elaborate it?
Okay, thank you for that question. You know, you would all know, I don't know whether you participated in the 2018 floods management, but what we saw at that point of time was outpouring of students coming in and helping in the process, which is also why the Nammal Namakai campaigns, etc. came in. So what I was talking about, there are multiple ways that you can associate. The best way is to look at, you could start with, if you are interested, you could look at an internship program with local governments and take on the responsibility of maybe associating with a specific sector that you are interested in. You want to look at disaster management, yes, you could come into that. You could actually enroll for the Sannadha Sena. Digitally, you can enroll for it, choose where you want to go, connect with the local government, and get training as an emergency response volunteer, so that you become someone who can give first aid, who can be involved in search and rescue, who has that capability and can be associated with that. So this is immediate disaster. Then you could also come in as a resource person, someone who is interested. You could become part of the local committees that are connected with the biodiversity. You know, there is a biodiversity committee. You can connect with that, become part of it, and through that you can get involved in ecosystem management in your panchayat or municipality. There is this particular interventions that I was talking about, be it DCAT, be it the LAP-CC, that is the Local Action Plan for Climate Change. This is happening right now in the Pamba Basin. You want to do it elsewhere, again, through KILA, and connect with KILA, become a resource person there, and connect with your local government and push the agenda forward. So there are multiple opportunities. I have right now, or rather I had, sorry, I forget that sometimes I'm retired. So we had in local self-government department, for the waste management intervention, we had a cell which was run by youngsters, by students and people who were between jobs, who had just finished their courses, and they were giving their entire time, and they're people who've actually been involved in fashioning how you can look at responsible waste management. They have looked at construction debris, they have looked at non-biodegradable debris, they've looked at sanitation waste, they've looked at transportation models that will handle this. So they've looked at the legal framework. So depending upon what your background is, we have found that we've been able to bring the capability and knowledge and enthusiasm of youngsters into this space. So yes, there are multiple ways. All you've got to do is just go and get your feet wet.
അഡാപ്റ്റേഷൻ്റെ മാത്രം പ്രശ്നമാണോ? ആ ലോക്കൽ ഫുട് പ്രിൻ്റ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് എന്തെങ്കിലും റെലവൻസ് ഉണ്ടോ?
നല്ലൊരു ചോദ്യമാണ്. നമ്മളിപ്പം പ്രധാനമായിട്ടും നമ്മൾ നോക്കിയിട്ടുള്ളത് ഇത് അന്തർദേശീയ തലത്തിലൊക്കെയുള്ള ഇടപെടലുകളാണ്. കേരളത്തിൻ്റെ ഒരു കാര്യം, ഇപ്പോൾ ഇവിടെ ഫണ്ടിൻ്റെ ഒരു കാര്യം പറഞ്ഞിരുന്നല്ലോ. നമ്മൾ കേരളത്തിൻ്റെ പശ്ചാത്തലത്തിൽ ഓർക്കേണ്ടുന്നത്, ഇപ്പോൾ ഒരു വർഷത്തിൽ എത്ര ഫണ്ടാണ് തദ്ദേശ ഭരണ സ്ഥാപനങ്ങളുടെ മേഖലയിലോട്ട് പോകുന്നത്? 8,000 കോടി പ്ലാനായിട്ട് വരുന്നു, ഒരു 3,000 കോടി തൊഴിലുറപ്പിൻ്റെ പ്രവർത്തനമായിട്ട് വരുന്നു. ബാക്കി കേന്ദ്രാവിഷ്കൃത പദ്ധതികളുടെ ഒരു 1,000-2,000 കോടി, ഇപ്പോൾ കുറഞ്ഞതൊരു 13,000-14,000 കോടി രൂപയാണ് ഇപ്പോൾ തദ്ദേശ ഭരണ തലത്തിൽ പോകുന്നത്. ഇപ്പോൾ സ്റ്റേറ്റിൻ്റെ റിസോഴ്സസിൻ്റെ ഒരു വലിയ പങ്ക് തന്നെയാണ് that goes in. And I'm only talking about plan. Non-planil വരുന്ന ഹ്യൂമൻ റിസോഴ്സ് കോസ്റ്റ് ഒന്നും ഇതിൻ്റെ അകത്ത് നമ്മൾ ക്യാപ്ചർ ചെയ്യുന്നില്ല. സോ ഫിനാൻസസിൻ്റെ ഒരു വലിയൊരു ശതമാനം, ആൻഡ് ഈ സെക്ടർ ക്ലൈമറ്റ് അഡാപ്റ്റേഷന് റെലവൻ്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള സെക്ടേഴ്സിനെ ഒക്കെ ബാധിക്കുന്ന പല ഏരിയാസും ഇതുണ്ട്. ശരിയാണ്, ഒരു കെൽപ്പ് ഫോറസ്റ്റ് നശീകരിക്കുന്നു, ഗ്ലോബൽ ടെമ്പറേച്ചർ നമ്മളിത് കൂട്ടുന്നതിനുള്ള ആ വിൻഡോ കുറയ്ക്കാനുള്ള വലിയൊരു സംഗതിയിൽ ഈ ലോക്കൽ ഫുട് പ്രിൻ്റ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ട് നമുക്ക് കാണാൻ പറ്റില്ല. പക്ഷേ റെസീലിയൻസ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് എന്താ? റെസീലിയൻസിനകത്ത് 2 തരത്തിലുള്ളതുണ്ട്. ഒന്ന്, അണ്ണാൻ കുഞ്ഞ് തന്നാലായത് എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിൽ, ശരി, ഞാനായിട്ട് I am not going to be contributing to increasing temperature or the devastation of the environment, because that our human activity തന്നെയാണ് ഈ പ്രശ്നത്തിൽ നമ്മളെ കൊണ്ട് എത്തിക്കുന്നത്. അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു ലാർജ് ഇപ്പം എല്ലാ നമ്മുടെ തദ്ദേശഭരണ സ്ഥാപനങ്ങളിൽ ഒരു 50-60% തദ്ദേശഭരണ സ്ഥാപനങ്ങൾ ആ ഒരു നിലപാടെടുക്കുകയും ശക്തമായിട്ട് അതിനു വേണ്ടി പ്രവർത്തിക്കുകയും ചെയ്താൽ തന്നെ വലിയൊരു മാറ്റം അത് സംസ്ഥാന തലത്തിലുള്ളൊരു മാറ്റമായിട്ട് വരും. ദാറ്റ് ഈസ്, പക്ഷെ അത് അണ്ണാൻ കുഞ്ഞിൻ്റെ ലെവലുള്ള മാറ്റമാണ്. ബട്ട് അഡാപ്റ്റേഷൻ എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ, റെസീലിയൻറ്റ് എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോഴത്തേക്കും അവിടെ വരുന്ന വിഷയം ഇസ് ദാറ്റ് ശരിയാണ്, ഞാൻ ക്ലൈമറ്റ് സ്മാർട്ട് അഗ്രികൾച്ചർ ഏറ്റെടുക്കുന്നത് കൊണ്ട് തന്നെ എൻ്റെ ലാൻഡ് യൂസ് ഇത് ചെയ്യുന്നത് കൊണ്ട് I changed the seed varieties that I use, I changed the kind of fertilizers that I use. ഇതെല്ലാം വെച്ചുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ what I am able to do is ഈ ഒരു ഡ്രൗട്ട് വരുമ്പോഴത്തേക്കും ഡ്രൗട്ട് റെസിസ്റ്റൻ്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഇത് എനിക്ക് ഉറപ്പാക്കാനായിട്ട് സാധിക്കുന്നു. സാധാരണ മഴയിൽ ഈ ഇപ്പം വെതർ ഇപ്പം നമുക്ക് ഇങ്ങനെ തെറ്റി വരുന്ന അബറൻ്റായിട്ട് വരുന്ന ഒരു വെതർ പാറ്റേണിന് ഡിപ്പെൻഡൻ്റ് അല്ലാത്ത ക്രോപ്പ് വെറൈറ്റി എനിക്ക് ഉണ്ടാക്കിയെടുക്കാനായിട്ട് എനിക്ക് വളർത്തി കൊണ്ടുവരാനായിട്ട് പറ്റുന്നു. ഐ എം മിനിമൈസിങ് മൈ റിസ്ക്. ആൻഡ് ഐ വുഡ് ഓൾസോ റിക്വയർ ടു ലുക്ക് അറ്റ് പല ഇതിൻ്റെ അകത്തും നമ്മളിത് ചെയ്യുന്നത് ലൈവ്ലിഹുഡിൻ്റെ മേഖലയിൽ ഡൈവേഴ്സിഫിക്കേഷൻ. എൻ്റെ ഒരു ഇത് റിസ്ക് ആണെങ്കിൽ മറ്റൊരു തരത്തിലുള്ള ലൈവ്ലിഹുഡ് ബാക്കപ്പ് എനിക്ക് ഉണ്ടാകുന്നു. അപ്പോൾ ഇങ്ങനെയൊക്കെയുള്ള തീരുമാനങ്ങൾ പ്രാദേശികമായിട്ടാണ് എടുക്കാൻ സാധ്യമാകുക. സോയിൽ കൺസർവേഷൻ, വാട്ടർ ഹാർവെസ്റ്റിംഗ്, ഇതൊക്കെ നമുക്ക് പ്രാദേശികമായിട്ട് ചെയ്യാനായിട്ട് സാധിക്കും. സോളാർ പാനലും ഒരു സോളാർ ഫിലമെൻറ്റ് ഫ്രീ കേരള എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ട് ഈ ഫിലമെൻറ്റ് ഫ്രീ കേരള ഇപ്പോൾ ഇലക്ട്രിസിറ്റി ബോർഡ് പുഷ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ടാവില്ല, അത് തദ്ദേശഭരണ സ്ഥാപനങ്ങൾ പുഷ് ചെയ്താൽ മാത്രമേ നടക്കുള്ളൂ. ആൻഡ് ആ രീതിയിലുള്ള ഇൻ്റർവെൻഷൻസ്, ഇപ്പോൾ പലതരത്തിലുള്ള ഇൻ്റർവെൻഷൻ, നമുക്ക് എനർജി സേവിങ്, എനർജി കൺസർവേഷൻ ആകാം, നമുക്ക് ഇപ്പം ഹ്യൂമൻ ലൈവ്ലിഹുഡിൻ്റെ ഡൈവേഴ്സിഫിക്കേഷനും റെസീലിയൻസ് എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിലാകാം, നമ്മുടെ എൻവയൺമെൻറ്റ്, ഇപ്പോൾ ബയോഡൈവേഴ്സിറ്റി ഞങ്ങൾ സൂചിപ്പിച്ചില്ലേ, ഇത്രയും ബയോഡൈവേഴ്സിറ്റി പ്രശ്നങ്ങൾ ഉണ്ടാകുമ്പോഴത്തേക്കും ആ ഡൈവേഴ്സിറ്റിനെ കൈകാര്യം ചെയ്യുന്നതാകാം. ഹ്യൂമൻ ആനിമൽ കോൺഫ്ലിക്റ്റ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് തന്നെ ഒരു അതിനെ കൈകാര്യം ചെയ്യുന്നത് തന്നെ ഒരു ക്ലൈമറ്റ് ചേഞ്ച് അഡാപ്റ്റേഷൻ ആണ്. അപ്പോൾ ഇതൊക്കെ പ്രാദേശികമായിട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നതിൻ്റെ കേപ്പബിലിറ്റി നമ്മൾ വളർത്തിക്കൊണ്ടുവരിക, അതിൻ്റെ ആവശ്യകത ബോധ്യപ്പെടുത്തുക, അത് പുഷ് ചെയ്യുക എന്നുള്ളത് വളരെ പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട ഒരു സംഗതി തന്നെയാണ്. താങ്ക് യു.
നമസ്കാരം മാഡം. മാഡം കേരളത്തിൻ്റെ ചീഫ് സെക്രട്ടറി ആയിട്ട് നമ്മുടെ അഡ്മിനിസ്ട്രേറ്റീവ് ഹെഡായിട്ട് നിന്ന ഒരാളാണ്. അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ ലോക്കൽ ഗവൺമെൻറ്റിൻ്റെ ഹെഡായിട്ട് നിന്നിട്ടുണ്ട്. നമ്മുടെ ഈ ബ്യൂറോക്രസിയും ലോക്കൽ ഗവൺമെൻറ്റും തമ്മിലുള്ള ഒരു കോൺഫ്ലിക്റ്റ് എല്ലാപ്പോഴും നിലനിൽക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. ഇപ്പോൾ നമ്മുടെ വയനാട്ടിലെ ലാൻഡ് സ്ലൈഡിൻ്റെ സമയത്ത് പോലും ഡാറ്റ കളക്ഷൻ്റെ സമയത്ത് ആ ഒരു വ്യത്യാസം, കുടുംബശ്രീയുടെ ഡാറ്റ കളക്ഷനും റവന്യൂ എടുക്കുന്ന ഡാറ്റ കളക്ഷൻ, അത് നമ്മൾ ഇപ്പോൾ 2018 ഫ്ലഡിൻ്റെ സമയത്താണെങ്കിലും ഓരോ ക്യാമ്പിൽ ഹെഡ് ചെയ്ത് റവന്യൂ ഉദ്യോഗസ്ഥരായിരുന്നു. പിന്നീട് ലോക്കൽ ഗവൺമെൻറ്റിൻ്റെ റെപ്രസെൻറ്റേറ്റീവ്സ് വരുമ്പോൾ അവിടെ ഒരു കോൺഫ്ലിക്ട്സ് ഉണ്ട്, എല്ലാ മേഖലയിലും ഒരു കോൺഫ്ലിക്ട്സ് ഉണ്ട്. ആ ഒരു പ്രശ്നം പരിഹരിക്കാണ്ട് നമുക്കിത് എത്രത്തോളം അതെങ്ങനെ അഡ്രസ്സ് ചെയ്യണം എന്നുള്ള കാര്യം കൂടെ പറയാമോ?
2018 ശേഷം ഒരു പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട മാറ്റം വന്നിട്ടുണ്ട് ഗവൺമെൻറ്റിൽ തന്നെ. ഇപ്പം ഈ പറഞ്ഞത് ശരിയാണ്. സാധാരണഗതിയിൽ തദ്ദേശഭരണ സ്ഥാപനങ്ങളുടെ റോള് ഞാൻ നേരത്തെ പറഞ്ഞല്ലോ, പരിമിതമായിട്ടുള്ള റോളേ നമ്മൾ കണ്ടിട്ടുള്ളൂ. അത് അത്രേ കണ്ടിട്ടുള്ളൂ എന്നുള്ളതിനൊരു കാരണം ഇതിൻ്റെ ഉത്തരവാദിത്വം നടത്തേണ്ടുന്നത് റവന്യൂ അഡ്മിനിസ്ട്രേഷനാണ്, പോലീസാണ്. ആൻഡ് മോർ ദാൻ ഇപ്പോൾ പോലീസിന് ഫസ്റ്റ് റെസ്പോണ്ടർ ജോലിയാണ്, പക്ഷേ ഇപ്പം ഡിസാസ്റ്റർ മാനേജ്മെൻറ്റിൻ്റെ ചുമതല മുഴുവനും ഇവിടെയാണ് ഇരിക്കുന്നത്, ജില്ലാ കളക്ടറാണ്. അപ്പോൾ ജില്ലാ കളക്ടർ ജില്ലയുടെ എല്ലാ ഉദ്യോഗസ്ഥരുടെയും ഇതാണ് എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോഴും തന്നെ ജില്ലാ കളക്ടർ റിപ്പോർട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നത് റവന്യൂ സെക്രട്ടറിയുടെ അടുത്താണ്. അപ്പം ചീഫ് സെക്രട്ടറി അതിന് പിന്നീടേ വരുന്നുള്ളൂ. അപ്പോൾ റവന്യൂ ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റും റവന്യൂ ഇതിനും ഉള്ള ഒരു ട്രഡീഷണൽ റോളായിട്ട് തന്നെയാണ് ദുരന്ത നിവാരണം കണ്ടത്. 2018 ശേഷമാണ് അത് മാറിയത്. ഐ ഡു നോട്ട് നോ ഇഫ് യു ആർ അവെയർ, 2018 ശേഷം 2019 ഡിസാസ്റ്റർ മാനേജ്മെൻറ്റ് എന്നുള്ളത് റവന്യൂ വകുപ്പിൻ്റെ ഉപവകുപ്പായിരുന്നത് അതിപ്പോൾ നേരിട്ട് മുഖ്യമന്ത്രിയുടെ കീഴിൽ കൊണ്ടുവന്നു. മുഖ്യമന്ത്രിയുടെ കീഴിൽ കൊണ്ടുവരുമ്പോൾ അതിൻ്റെ അണ്ടർസ്റ്റാൻഡിങ് എന്താണ്? ഇത് റവന്യൂ വകുപ്പിൻ്റെ പ്രവർത്തന മണ്ഡലത്തിൽ മാത്രം ഒതുങ്ങുന്നതല്ല ഡിസാസ്റ്റർ. അപ്പോൾ KSDMA, കേരള സ്റ്റേറ്റ് ഡിസാസ്റ്റർ മാനേജ്മെൻറ്റ് അതോറിറ്റി എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് 2018 മുമ്പ് തദ്ദേശഭരണ സ്ഥാപനങ്ങൾക്കൊരു ചുക്കും ചെയ്യാൻ പാടില്ല എന്നുള്ളൊരു ധാരണയിലും ഒരു രീതിയിലും നിന്നിരുന്ന ഒരു അതോറിറ്റി 2019 നമ്മുടെ പ്രാദേശികമായിട്ടുള്ള ലോക്കൽ ഡിസാസ്റ്റർ മാനേജ്മെൻറ്റ് പ്ലാനുകൾ കാണുകയും ഇതിൽ മിറ്റിഗേഷൻ്റെ സാധ്യതകൾ കാണുകയും ഒക്കെ ചെയ്തപ്പോഴത്തേക്കും ഈ അതോറിറ്റിക്ക് കാര്യങ്ങളൊക്കെ പറയാം, പക്ഷേ അതോറിറ്റിക്ക് എല്ലാം കൂടി കിട്ടുന്നത് 200 കോടി ഫണ്ട്. ഇവിടെ ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞല്ലോ 13,000 കോടിയാണ് തദ്ദേശ ഭരണ തലത്തിൽ പോകുന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ അതിനെ നല്ല രീതിയിൽ ടാപ്പ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റിയാൽ, അത് നല്ല ഇൻപുട്ട് കൊടുക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ ഒരു ധാരാളം റിസോഴ്സസ് തന്നെ ഇതിനകത്തോട്ട് നമുക്ക് ദുരന്ത നിവാരണ പ്രവർത്തനത്തിനകത്തോട്ട് കൊണ്ടുവരാൻ സാധിക്കും എന്നുള്ള തിരിച്ചറിവോടുകൂടി ഇപ്പോൾ ദുരന്ത നിവാരണ അതോറിറ്റി വളരെ ശക്തമായിട്ട് തന്നെ തദ്ദേശ ഭരണ സ്ഥാപനങ്ങളുടെ പ്രവർത്തനങ്ങളെയും ഇതിനെയും സപ്പോർട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നു. അവിടെ കൊണ്ട് മാത്രം തീരുന്നുമില്ല. നമുക്ക് ഡിസാസ്റ്റർ മാനേജ്മെൻറ്റിൽ വാട്ട് ഈസ് ഇറ്റ് ദാറ്റ് ഐ വാണ്ടഡ് ടു സേ, ഒരു മൂന്നാമതൊരു പോയിന്റ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു, അത് വിട്ടുപോയി, സാരമില്ല. എനിവേ, ഇപ്പം ജില്ലാ കളക്ടർമാരും, ഇപ്പം ഞാൻ ഇത് പറഞ്ഞിരുന്നു, ഇപ്പം ജില്ലാ കളക്ടർമാരെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം ഇപ്പം അത് അൺഫോർച്ചുനേറ്റ്ലി ഞങ്ങളുടെ ബ്യൂറോക്രസിയിൽ IAS എന്നുള്ളൊരു ഇതിൻ്റെ അകത്ത് തന്നെ ഒരു ഹൈറാർക്കിക്കലായിട്ട് പോകുമ്പോൾ റവന്യൂ ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റ് ഇത് കൺട്രോൾ ചെയ്യുക, ഇതൊക്കെ നമുക്ക് സൗകര്യം പിടിച്ച കാര്യങ്ങളാണ്. തദ്ദേശ ഭരണ സ്ഥാപനം വരുമ്പോഴത്തേക്ക് നമ്മുടെ കയ്യിൽ ഒതുങ്ങുന്നതല്ല തദ്ദേശ ഭരണം. അത് ഇൻഡിപെൻഡൻ്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ജനപ്രതിനിധികളുണ്ട്, അവർക്ക് അവരുടേതായിട്ടുള്ള ശക്തികളുണ്ട്. അവർ നമ്മളുടെ അടുത്ത്, നമ്മുടെ കീഴുദ്യോഗസ്ഥർ നമ്മൾ പറയുന്നത് പോലെ തുള്ളി നിൽക്കുകയൊന്നും ചെയ്യൂല. അപ്പോൾ അതുകൊണ്ട് അവിടെ കുറെക്കൂടെ ഫെസിലിറ്റേറ്ററി ആയിട്ടുള്ള റോളിലോട്ട് ഭരണ നേതൃത്വം മാറണം. ഇത് പൂർണ്ണമായിട്ടും കേരളത്തിൻ്റെ ബ്യൂറോക്രസി ഉൾക്കൊണ്ടിട്ടില്ല. അത് IASൻ്റെ തലത്തിൽ മാത്രമല്ല, മറ്റ് ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റുകളുടെ തലത്തിലും അത് പ്രയാസമായിട്ട് തന്നെ തുടരുന്നുണ്ട്. എങ്കിലും ഇത്തരത്തിലുള്ള സംയോജനം, ഞാൻ ഒരു എക്സാമ്പിൾ പറയാം. ഇപ്പം ഈ പ്രശ്നങ്ങൾ പറയുമ്പോഴത്തേക്കും നമുക്ക് വന്നിട്ടുള്ള മാറ്റം നോക്കണല്ലോ. 2018 അഗൈൻ ഇതൊരു, ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞില്ല, വാട്ടർഷെഡ് ഇയറാണ്. അതിനു മുമ്പ് ഒരു ഡേറ്റാബേസ്, ഒരു ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റിന് ഒരു ഡേറ്റാബേസ് മറ്റാർക്കും കൊടുക്കില്ല, അറിയൂല്ല, ഷെയർ ചെയ്യില്ല. നമുക്ക് അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ ഇപ്പം എനിക്കിപ്പോൾ പാവപ്പെട്ടവരെന്നുള്ളത് സോഷ്യൽ ജസ്റ്റിസ് ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റിന് ആവശ്യമാണ്, ഹെൽത്തിന് ആവശ്യമാണ്, എഡ്യൂക്കേഷൻ ആവശ്യമാണ്. അവർ പല പ്രവർത്തനങ്ങളും അവർ പ്ലാൻ ചെയ്യണമെങ്കിൽ ഇതിന് വിവരങ്ങൾ കിട്ടണം. പക്ഷേ ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റ് ഷെയർ ചെയ്യില്ല വിവരം. ഇപ്പോൾ ഈ ഡേറ്റാബേസുകളെല്ലാം തന്നെ ഒരുമിച്ച് ഷെയർ ചെയ്യേണ്ടതാണെന്നും ഇത് കോർഡിനേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നതിന് വേണ്ടി കെസ്റക്കിനെ ചുമതലപ്പെടുത്തുകയും അത് എല്ലാവർക്കും അവർക്ക് ആവശ്യാനുസൃതമുള്ള ഡേറ്റാബേസുകൾ ലഭ്യമാക്കണമെന്നുള്ള രീതിയിലോട്ട് മാറി. അപ്പോൾ കൺവേർജൻസിൻ്റെ സാധ്യതകൾ നമ്മൾ ഉണ്ടാക്കിക്കൊണ്ട് വരുന്നു. അത് ഇറ്റ് ഇസ് സ്റ്റിൽ എ വർക്ക് ഇൻ പ്രോഗ്രസ്. ഇപ്പോൾ വയനാട്ടിൻ്റെ നമ്മുടെ ഇപ്പോൾ മേപ്പാടി ദുരന്തം വരുന്ന സമയത്ത് ഫൈനലി നമ്മൾ ആധികാരികമായിട്ടുള്ളൊരു ഡേറ്റ നമ്മളെടുത്തു. ആധികാരികമായിട്ട് തന്നെ തദ്ദേശ ഭരണ സ്ഥാപനങ്ങളും ആശയും അംഗൻവാടി വർക്കറും കുടുംബശ്രീയും കൂടി ചേർന്നുകൊണ്ടുള്ള മൈക്രോ പ്ലാൻ, ലൈവ്ലിഹുഡ് മൈക്രോ പ്ലാൻ ഇപ്പം കുടുംബങ്ങൾക്ക് വേണ്ടി നമ്മൾ സെറ്റ് ചെയ്തു. കുടുംബശ്രീയുടെ ഡേറ്റാബേസും ഇതുമൊക്കെ കൺഫ്യൂഷൻ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞല്ലോ. ആ ഡേറ്റാബേസിൻ്റെ കൺഫ്യൂഷൻ എന്തായിരുന്നു? നമ്മൾ വാസ്തവത്തിൽ ആദ്യമായിട്ടാണ് ഇങ്ങനെയൊരു ഇത്രയും ഡിവാസ്റ്റേറ്റിംഗ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു ചെറിയൊരു ഏരിയയിലാണെങ്കിലും ഇത്രയും കംപ്ലീറ്റ് ഡിവാസ്റ്റേഷൻ ഉണ്ടായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു അനുഭവം നമുക്കില്ല, മുൻ അനുഭവം ഇല്ല. അപ്പോൾ എല്ലാ ഡേറ്റയും പോയി. എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഇത് ഡേറ്റ പിടിക്കുക? അപ്പം നിലവിലുള്ള ഡേറ്റാബേസുകൾ വെച്ച് നമ്മൾ പിടിക്കാൻ നോക്കുക. അപ്പം നമ്മൾ എന്താണ് ചെയ്തത്? എന്ത് ഡേറ്റാബേസ് ഉണ്ട്? നമുക്ക് കറണ്ടിൻ്റെ ഡേറ്റാബേസ് ഉണ്ടോ, കൺസ്യൂമർ ബേസ് ഉണ്ടോ, ഇപ്പം നമ്മുടെ റേഷൻ കാർഡിൻ്റെ ഇത് വെച്ചുകൊണ്ടുള്ള ഡേറ്റാബേസ് ഉണ്ടോ? കുടുംബശ്രീയുടെ ഡേറ്റാബേസ് എവിടെയാണ് റെലവെൻ്റ് ആവുന്നത്? കുടുംബശ്രീ ഡേറ്റാബേസ് അല്ല, ഹരിതകർമ്മസേനയുടെ ഡേറ്റാബേസാണ്. കാരണം ഹരിതകർമ്മസേനയെ നമ്മൾ ഓൺലൈൻ ആക്കി, ഇപ്പോൾ MIS ഉണ്ടാക്കിയിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. ഹരിതകർമ്മയുടെ ഡേറ്റാബേസ് വെച്ചിട്ട് ഇതൊന്നും പൂർണ്ണമല്ല. പക്ഷേ ഇതെല്ലാം കൂടി ചേർത്തിട്ട് അതിൽ നിന്ന് ഒരു വിശകലനം നടത്തി ആ ഡേറ്റാബേസുകൾ കൂടി വിശകലനം ചെയ്ത് കംപ്ലീറ്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ളൊരു ഡേറ്റാബേസ് ഉണ്ടാക്കുകയാണ് ചെയ്തത്. അപ്പോൾ തുടക്കത്തിൽ അത് കൺഫ്യൂഷനായിട്ട് തോന്നിയിട്ടുണ്ടാകാം. പക്ഷേ വാസ്തവത്തിൽ ആദ്യമായിട്ടാണ് ഒരു ഇൻറ്റഗ്രേറ്റഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ളൊരു ഡേറ്റാബേസ് നമ്മൾ ഇപ്പോൾ ഡിജിറ്റൽ ഡേറ്റാബേസുകളും കൂടി ഉപയോഗിച്ച് നമുക്ക് എടുക്കാനായുള്ള ഒരു ഇടപെടൽ നടന്നത്.
Hi ma'am, my name is Nakshatra from UC College. എനിക്ക് ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ അല്ല, ഒരു ഐഡിയ ആണുള്ളത്. ഇപ്പോൾ ഭൂട്ടാൻ ഈസ് നോൺ ആസ് ദി വേൾഡ്സ് കാർബൺ സിങ്ക്. അതേപോലെ ഇന്ത്യയിലും ആനന്ദ് അംബാനിയുടെ വൻതാര എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞൊരു പ്രൊജക്റ്റ് ഉണ്ട്. അതേപോലെ കേരളത്തിലും ഇങ്ങനെ ഒരു കാർബൺ സിങ്ക് ഉണ്ടാക്കുക എന്നുള്ളത് എത്രത്തോളം റെലവെൻ്റാണ്? ബിക്കോസ് നമ്മുടെ ഇന്ത്യ ഒരു ഡെവലപ്പിംഗ് കൺട്രിയാ, കുറേ അധികം ഇൻഡസ്ട്രീസ് ഉണ്ടാവുന്നുണ്ട്, അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ കുറേ അധികം കാർബൺ എമിഷൻ വരുന്നുണ്ട്. ആൻഡ് ഇതൊക്കെ ഡൈവേഴ്സ്ലി ക്ലൈമറ്റ് ചേഞ്ചിനെയും നന്നായി എഫക്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ട്. സോ ഒരു കാർബൺ സിങ്ക് ലൈക് വേൾഡിന് മൊത്തമല്ലെങ്കിലും ഇന്ത്യയിലെ കാർബൺ സിങ്ക് ആവാൻ വേണ്ടി കേരളത്തിന് പറ്റും. ഒരു പന്താര പോലെയുള്ള ഒരു അറ്റ്മോസ്ഫിയർ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ കാർബൺ സിങ്ക് കേരളത്തിൽ ഉണ്ടാക്കാൻ പറ്റുമോ?
I am not competent to answer that, but what I say is that we have carbon neutral local government carbon footprint കുറയ്ക്കുന്ന ഇടപെടൽ. What are the കേരളത്തിനെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം where is our carbon footprint coming from primarily? നമുക്ക് ഏറ്റവും കൂടുതൽ ഇത് ട്രാൻസ്പോർട്ടേഷനും ആണ്, അതിന് അഗ്രികൾച്ചർ ഉണ്ട്, and waste management also a contributor. But there have about 7 or 8 significant contributors that have been identified. And what is required is policy that will look at reducing this. Independent of the that is happening at the state, you have had panchayats coming up and say, okay, the very first carbon neutral panchayat in the country is Meenamadi in Wayanad, which has taken that kind of initiative to understand how do you reduce carbon footprint. It has brought in experts from all kinds of fields and looked at intervention, looked at where the emissions are coming from, what are the kind of emissions that can be reduced into what extent, and trying to quantify all of that. This is something which has already been happening. As part of the LAPCC and the risk-informed master plans, one very clear section is also about carbon sequestration. Where is it, how is it possible to do a carbon sequestration? So it is again, but it's very locally adapted as what is the possibility locally. At the state level, the central level, that is a much larger and much bigger issue.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, on behalf of CACS, I request Professor P.K. Michael Tharagan to hand over the memento as a token of appreciation to Ms. Sarada Muraleedharan. And on behalf of SMS, I request Dr. Am Thomas to hand over the memento to Ms. Sarada Muraleedharan. To conclude today's program, I invite Dr. Ragi Timothy, fellow CSES, to propose the formal vote of thanks.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of CSES and School of Management Studies, CUSAT. First and foremost, I would like to thank Ms. Sarada Muraleedharan for delivering Professor K.K. George Memorial Lecture 2025, for speaking to choose on a topic, decentralized governance and climate resilience, a topic which is of high importance in the case of Kerala. Also for touching upon the importance of evidence-based planning, the need for local action plan, and the challenges they face in implementing this, and some of the suggestions to improve the situation to combat climate change. I would also like to thank Professor P.K. Michael Tharagan for delivering the presidential address, for recollecting his memories of Professor George, for highlighting Professor George's contribution to Kerala's development issues, and also stressing its continued relevance to some of the problems faced by Kerala economy and society. I always special thanks to George's family who are here. For all of us at CSES, Professor George provided the much needed academic leadership in terms of setting research priorities and also maintaining the quality of research output of the center. I'm sure he's fondly missed by his colleagues, his students, teachers, friends, and today's gathering is definitely a testament to that. On behalf of CSES and School of Management Studies, I thank each one of you, all the distinguished guests, teachers, friends, students who are gathered here, both offline and online, and all those who have participated in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. With that, we bring today's memorial lecture to a close. Thank you all for your presence, engagement, and continued support in carrying forward the legacy of Professor K.K. George. Have a wonderful day.